Thank you very much, Professor Minley. It's a tremendous privilege to be here, and I'm not often introduced as the father of 8 children, but it is probably the thing for which I'm most grateful. Look, distinguished colleagues of Zhejiang University, students and friends, it is an incredible privilege to have been invited to speak with you today about something that I think has grown increasingly vital to our modern way of doing business, of research, and even socializing, namely our ability to cooperate with others, not just across disciplines, but also across borders, across cultures, across languages, to make a positive impact on the world. And in lots of ways, there's never been a more important time to be thinking about this topic, about what it means to work across difference and to work across borders. And so it's an honor to be appearing in a lecture series that's seen Zhejiang University generously host so many wonderful speakers from the rest of the world. And I'm particularly pleased to be following in the footsteps of my UCL colleague and the Nobel Prize winner, Professor John O'Keefe, who got the Nobel Prize in 2014 for physiology and medicine. So look, in an average day, as president and provost of UCL, I'm presented with lots of facts and figures. Staffing numbers, finance numbers, infrastructure and building project numbers, research numbers, the list goes on. Now, the meaning of some numbers is very obvious. £1 million is £1 million. One student is one student. Some numbers, however, are not so obviously compelling or meaningful. For instance, we've just built a 180,000 square metre campus on the former Olympic site in East London. But say that number to an average Londoner and they might say, so what? Or you might get a blank face. But when you tell a Londoner that that area is the same as 7 Wembley football pitches, then they know exactly what it means. Indeed, they'll probably wonder how we managed to find so much building space in London. And of course, for even bigger projects, you need even bigger units of measurement. To help explain the size of Neom, the Saudi Arabian 27,000 square kilometre megacity, they've come up with a new scale of measurement, New York's and Belgium's. So they tell us that Neom's area is either 7 New Yorks or 1 Belgium. Perhaps saying that it's 2/3 of a Hainan would be even better. So those small changes in the way that we express ourselves, just changing the unit of measurement from thousands of square metres to football pitches, is a simple example of a special kind of skill, a special kind of competency. The ability to make your meaning better understood to people with a different frame of reference. That difference can be caused by many sorts of division or differences: culture, nationality, language, profession, academic discipline, educational background, age, or even interests. It's a difference we experience in my own house because my wife is Korean and I am not, and those cultures shape our understanding of the world in very different ways. And there's an expectation now that not just in my home, but in universities and society more broadly, we should be able to work across these various interfaces. But how are we going to do it? And why should we bother? Well, today I hope to give some insight into how world-leading universities such as Zhejiang and UCL demonstrate those competencies and how we enable our students and our staff better to work across boundaries, both in their academic lives, but also importantly in their careers. I'll outline why the rewards far outweigh the challenges and why thinking like a researcher can be a valuable asset to all, no matter what path you actually take in life. So I began by saying that some statistics can feel a bit unimpressive, but there's one figure that's stuck in my mind since I heard it. Last year, there were more than 19,000 collaborative research publications between Chinese university researchers and their British peers. That's a remarkable figure, particularly when you realize that it's 6 times more than the equivalent number in the 1990s. That number speaks to increasingly close links shared interests, and international outlooks of academic communities here in China and in the UK. 5% of all those papers involved a colleague from Zhejiang University working with a colleague in the UK. 9% involved a UCL colleague working with a counterpart in China. When one considers the scale of the university sector in both countries, that's an incredible achievement for our two institutions and an example of a shared internationalist outlook. But behind each of those many papers, there's an individual story of person-to-person cooperation. Taken collectively, these form part of a far larger narrative about Chinese and British research cooperation, one that speaks to two shared aims: the pursuit of new knowledge and the desire to make a positive impact in the world. So the first interface competency I'd like to address is international. Why is it important? Well, the impetus for international scientific collaborations is, of course, not a new one. It's increased over time, though, and it shows no sign of slowing. Any analysis of the numbers of international publications will serve as a useful proxy for collaboration in many subjects and will show that the UK and China are world leaders in research collaboration. But what motivates international collaboration? Well, the answer to that depends on sector. For universities, some would argue that progress, coupled with the increasing specialization of scientific disciplines, means that researchers require ever more knowledge in order to make significant advances. This demand can often only be met by pooling one's knowledge with others, both domestically and internationally. Even the largest and most comprehensive universities will not have all the expertise on their campuses to grapple with the urgent challenges that face the world. Likewise, the instrumentation needed for some disciplines is increasingly complex and often large scale. Even the most well-funded university might struggle to find space for its own synchrotron or particle collider. More and more, we look to shared resources both nationally and internationally. In this new era where geographical distance feels less and less important, it should be no surprise to us that CERN, home of the Large Hadron Collider, co-publishes more with Tsinghua, 5,700 miles away, than it does with Oxford, only 500 miles away. Of course, many wise university leaders here in China and the UK long ago made the connection between international publications, increased citations, impact, and increased rankings in global league tables. At UCL, we know that our collaborations with universities in China markedly outperform our domestic collaborations in terms of their citation impact ratings. UCL's rightly proud to feature along Zhejiang University in the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings top 5 institutions by volume of publications in the most impactful journals. But these are more instrumental values and measures, perhaps more frequently considered by university leaders than by researchers or by students. Instead, I'd argue that it's the intrinsic or inherent values of international collaboration that have helped embed it as a reflex in modern research. Integral to a researcher's interest in collaboration is the underlying awareness that it will increase the quality and the impact of their research. They'll knowingly sacrifice the ease of acting alone for the scale of delivery that can be unlocked by a team. They'll often forego personal acclaim in order to make a greater advancement with others. So although academia recognizes and rewards individual excellence, even our great soloists enjoy being part of an orchestra. And for a group of people so well trained in the fine arts of disagreement, academic researchers can also demonstrate a surprising capacity for shared purpose. Shared purpose is why UCL researchers might find themselves working with colleagues at Zhejiang University's Institute of Cultural Heritage to support the digitizations of wallpaper paintings in the beautiful historic temples of Shanxi province. Shared purpose is why a UCL researcher might find herself in a wheat field in the northern China plain, shoulder to shoulder with a colleague from the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, devising new techniques to improve food security. In future, it might be those same techniques that could be adapted for use in Germany, in Argentina, or in Egypt. A common characteristic at many major universities is that we aim to be important local, regional, national, and global universities at the same time. We are, after all, academic communities with a space and a place in our local environment and community. We are deeply culturally embedded. We must keep domestic priorities in mind and ensure that we serve the public that support and surround us. That's why it's a problem, for example, that the international rankings penalize so heavily publications that are not in English. But to do this well, we also have to be visible and viable partners on the world stage. It's a tough balancing act organizationally and strategically, but individual academics often do it gracefully. They succeed because the inquisitive drive in the hearts of all researchers seems to pay little heed to disciplines, distance, or domains. Local challenges are higher on their agenda, but more often than not, they'll see parallels to the local in global problems, recognizing that we're all in the same boat in a stormy sea. For instance, there would be few in the UK who would consider how AI could support healthcare in our hospitals without looking to China for its work and inspiration in this cutting-edge area of practice. External frameworks like the UN Sustainable Development Goals can certainly help with both clarifying these problems and galvanizing people to act together. With China and the UK leading the way in many of the SDGs, there are strong signs for future collaboration. If the SDGs, those great challenges of our time, require that researchers give less consideration to disciplinary boundaries and to be receptive to ideas from outside their domain, then it's right that we turn, in concert with our trusted partners, make the boundaries of our institutions look a bit more porous too. That doesn't mean giving up those qualities and characteristics that make us unique. As the physical scientists and the audience will know, an alloy can be remarkably durable and strong. So too, I'd argue that our differences can be a source of strength for our partnerships. The diverse compositions, constitutions, and traditions of universities in different countries can cause our researchers to look at a problem from an entirely new perspectives. Indeed, it's those new perspectives that give international collaboration such a rejuvenating effect, even on venerable institutions, and dare I say, even on venerable old researchers. Just as our universities bring brilliant young people to our towns and cities each year, collaboration can bring brilliant young ideas to light. Of course, you may be politely sitting here this afternoon thinking that none of this is relevant to you because you don't want to be a researcher. Perhaps you're planning a career in industry. But I'd ask you, how many companies' ambitions start and end in one town, one city, one province, or even one country? It's clear that the ambitions of many businesses, both in the UK and in China, are international. China has long had the world's largest share of global export goods by a vast margin. Exports of goods and services now accounts for 20% of China's GDP and 30% of the UK's GDP. These figures point to a need for international competence, for international cultural competence at every level within a company. Given that we're here in Hangzhou, I should probably also point out that Alibaba Group have a Chinese CEO working alongside a Canadian president. And of course, the CEO of TikTok, working here in China, is a UCL alumnus from Singapore. So in your working life, I would implore you to always think like a top researcher. Let your curiosity guide you. Think about how local challenges might have global solutions. And don't let your inspiration or information end at the border of any single province. So researchers are equipped to find common aims and partners internationally. But how can universities themselves be similarly prepared? It's perhaps worth considering whether an institution's mission reflects the collaborative impulse of its academic community. Intrinsic to our mission at UCL is the desire to forge partnerships for change. The university should be a place which actively enables collaboration between research staff, between teachers, between students and staff, between students and partners, where education, research, innovation and enterprise are held together, and when the disciplines are brought together to find solutions to global problems. Too many universities aren't universities, they're parallel silos of departments offering different disciplines and thinking within a narrow frame. Too many university promotion systems encourage that siloization. And a test of the success for any strategy at UCL will be whether it's assisted in lowering the barriers to this kind of partnership. So meaningful collaboration is central in my thinking, just as it's central to the thinking of my colleagues. The barriers that exist between universities, companies, or even countries are often genuine but eminently solvable. Legal complexities, regulatory differences, bureaucratic quirks that no one quite knows the origins of. We need skilled policymakers and administrators to keep the barriers down. But some barriers feel a bit higher. A lack of cultural understanding, language barriers, differing priorities. Again, these are not problems that can't be solved, but crucially they take longer to resolve, and they require the goodwill and the patience of both partners to achieve. It's a sad reality that sometimes that goodwill can be in short supply. As someone who has spent my career actively involved in fostering stronger engagement with China as a university leader, I find myself sometimes disappointed at the poor quality of thinking about UK-China cooperation, particularly as expressed by certain sections of the UK's political media. But I'm optimistic. You may know that I'm a proud student of Chinese language and culture, and if there's one thing that I've learned about China, it's that a culture with several thousand years of history is a patient one, with long-term horizons and a well-practiced ability to see past short-term thinking. From what I see in the UK, a better grasp of the historic and contemporary currents of both China and the UK should help set the relationship in a clearer context. And a more historically aware understanding would make the success of our present-day relationships all the more admirable. If Chinese and UK universities, and indeed China's and UK's businesses, are to continue to build on the exceptional foundation of collaboration that's been established over the past 25 years, it will be in our mutual interests as colleagues and friends to jointly lower the barriers on both sides to cultural understanding. For students soon to graduate here in Hangzhou, you'll almost certainly have to play a part in this, as will our graduates back in London. And so the second interface competency I'd like to address is if our students and researchers need to be international in outlook, they also need to be intercultural. Given their similarities, you might think international and intercultural might mean the same thing, but they are different, with intercultural implying a broader range of possibilities. To put it one way, many international experiences are intercultural, but not all intercultural experiences are necessarily international. Language learning is a core part of intercultural understanding. Language is a lens through which we understand our world. It's an architecture or scaffolding that helps structure our thoughts and make sense of the information we receive. When we talk about intercultural competency, we also need to think critically about the links between languages, societies, and cultures. For instance, English speakers learning Mandarin Chinese often find that Chinese sentences tend to present contextual information, such as time or place, before the action. This linguistic structure may have cultural significance, perhaps reflecting a greater emphasis on holistic or contextualized perspectives in Chinese culture compared to English-speaking societies. Sounds like a PhD waiting to be written. My wife's Korean, and we use Korean and English at home with our children. The strongly socially hierarchical nature of Korean grammar, Korean has 5 different linguistic registers, not only for reflected in verb forms, but also reflected in noun forms and in honorific markers. The strongly hierarchical nature of Korean grammar is something deeply written in my wife's cultural DNA, but something quite foreign to my egalitarian spirit. There's another PhD. So when on New Year's Day, my children are required to bow before me and to put their forehead on the floor, my spirit balks. And yet it's something that happens every day in our house in the way that my children talk to me, to my wife, and to their grandparents. But culture is not simply determined by the country that people are from, nor by the country where somebody is working. One famous university that has a campus in Shanghai, I once heard the president boast that the classes in Shanghai are different to the classes in New York because although they deliver exactly the same material and try to do it in the exact same way as in New York, the students are different, as if he were rather surprised by that. But education's not like McDonald's. You can't just plant it from one place to another. Culture is not simply determined by the country people are from. People take up different identities in the world, and those identities are not permanently fixed. If you were raised in a rural location and moved to a city, perhaps you might feel your cultural associations and values adapt or grow, or if you moved country, or even just as you get older. There can be many drivers in forming our cultural and subcultural identities. So intercultural understanding is not just about stereotyping on the basis of nationality. It's about taking time to consider the complex identity of others in the round. It's about the skill of informed listening and making sure that we give space to the other to be the other. Well, I would argue that this is a skill that anyone can acquire, and again, the researcher mindset can be useful in this. Researchers must not assume they know the answer before the question is asked, just as we must not assume that we know who other people are before we've allowed them to tell us. So firstly, it's about trying to recognize that our preconceptions, whilst a useful shortcut, can sometimes be dangerous. Given we all process so much cultural information daily, it can be sometimes tempting to take it at face value. There may be some people in the audience today who basically some of their thinking of the UK on Sherlock Holmes. They might well be surprised to learn that Mr. Bean can sometimes be closer to the truth. Well, second, the researcher mindset is to seek beautiful solutions from difficult problems. Cultural difference can sometimes feel like a problem, a source of friction, as sort of like a grain of sand in the oyster. But although the oyster finds the grain of sand irritating and annoying, it eventually soon starts to build a pearl, highly desirable and beautiful. So I'd encourage you to think of cultural difference not just as an irritation, but of something interesting and worthwhile. And it does mean that universities need to be places of genuine diversity, places in which a difference of worldviews are genuinely able to be understood, and that we need then to learn how to disagree with one another and to disagree with one another well and in a way that shows respect and a capacity to listen. For those of you who'll enter the business world, you'll find now that a premium is placed on intercultural competency. We did a survey in my last university of employers across Asia, the United States, and Europe, and asked them about the graduates and their attributes that they most admired and needed. Perhaps surprisingly, most of them came back and said things like philosophers, and it was precisely this skill to listen that they thought was important. So I'd argue that intercultural competency is an end in itself, but it clearly also brings commercial benefits. It seems obvious to say that trust is of significance, important to international trade. Intercultural understanding facilitates trust building because it demonstrates a baseline respect for cultural values. It helps to create a bigger zone of understanding between two distinct cultures. And most importantly, it helps to minimize misunderstandings that normally come with a price tag attached to them. Trust is essential for successful collaborations, as it encourages information sharing, cooperation, and joint risk-taking. So by actively engaging in intercultural understanding, businesses can bridge gaps, mitigate conflicts, and establish trust-based partnerships. Well, for those of you who thought that your education journey might end once you graduate, then I'm afraid I've got some news for you. It won't. Not only will you not stop learning, but you also find that you become an educator yourself. Perhaps you'll find yourself having tea with a clinical colleague, helping them to understand the importance and relevance of quantum computing to drug discovery or healthcare optimization. Or perhaps you might find yourself standing on a stage just like this somewhere in London, speaking to a group of British colleagues about the importance of understanding the cultural context of business relationships and how more effectively to develop trust with Chinese partners. Finally, I'd like to turn to the last competency, to the last skill that I want to address today. If researchers, and therefore I think successful not only researchers, but also professionals and business people need this international capacity, this intercultural capacity, I think they also need a certain interprofessional competency, the ability to work comfortably with colleagues from different sectors and job categories in the university and in business. In the university, we can also think of it as a kind of interdisciplinary competency. Much like international collaboration, this involves working together to achieve common goals, but with a focus on leveraging the unique expertise and perspectives of each professional to give better outcomes. The disciplines all have different methodological tools, different methodological tools, different core values, different core learnings, different learning cultures. And just as a researcher needs to learn to be international and intercultural, she needs to work effectively in a modern university also to develop that interdisciplinary culture. So in today's complex and interconnected world, almost all great challenges require multidisciplinary solutions that transcend the boundaries of a single profession or academic discipline. Think, for example, of the obvious one, addressing climate change. If science alone were enough, then we would long since have solved it. But in many ways, the climate crisis is not a scientific crisis, it's a social scientific crisis. And many of the solutions to the climate crisis are going to be social scientific as much as they are scientific. It will require massive input from scientists, sure, but it will also need policymakers, engineers, economists, social scientists, historians, and even artists to help us enact the change we need. Each profession will bring its distinctive lens and set of values to the table and enable a more comprehensive and effective approach to problem solving. Think, for example, how in many countries the health problems associated with smoking were addressed. They were not primarily addressed by clinicians lecturing people in hospitals and doctors' waiting rooms. They were addressed by filmmakers taking cigarettes out of films, and making smoking no longer seem cool, but sort of gross. But fostering interdisciplinary or interprofessional collaboration is not without its challenges. Disciplinary boundaries tend to create silos and hinder effective communication and collaboration. They can foster distrust or informal hierarchies, one discipline regarding itself as more important than others. More practically, researchers can face difficulties in securing funding for interdisciplinary projects, as funding agencies still sometimes tend towards traditional disciplinary-based frameworks. And governments, too, can prioritise funding for what they see as the relatively safe disciplines of medicine and the hard sciences over funding for the social sciences and the arts. Governments all over the world. But breaking down these kinds of silos is not about grudgingly working side by side. It requires a recognition that one's own profession has its limits, and then the willingness to integrate diverse perspectives into solutions. Although universities, rather like funding agencies, do think that disciplinary research is still vitally important, and it is, right? It's the disciplines that developed the methodologies that have so much epistemic power. It's the disciplines that developed the methodologies that in so many ways help us understand the world. So we do think disciplinary research is still vitally important, but we should actively also seek to support our students in developing interprofessional collaboration skills. By creating interdisciplinary programs and initiatives, we try to encourage students to engage with peers from different disciplines, promoting a holistic understanding of complex problems. Interestingly, again, when we surveyed employers from the United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia, the 4 things they said that students required was a deep understanding of a discipline, an interdisciplinary perspective, an international perspective, and an ability to bring those things together with others from other disciplines to solve practical problems. Well, sometimes as students, particularly as you approach the end of the degree, you might feel that you've developed a deep specialism, and that perhaps is not the area that you'll pursue as a career. Well, I can assure you that even if that's true, in a good university like this one, you'll have developed a far broader set of skills, as well as affinities and sympathies for other disciplines too. Sometimes this can happen as a part of your formal program, but in a good university, and this is why it's important to be in a university, a comprehensive university, and not somewhere like Imperial College or LSE that's only apart universities. In your dormitories or lectures and cafes, you also acquire that interprofessional skill from other students. And if there are any students here from the ZJU School of Management, I'm sure that later on they'll be able to more fully explain to you the concept of a T-shaped person and why these so-called generalized specialists are now sought after in many sectors. Well, I've spoken today about many of the values of collaboration at the frontiers of cultures, of disciplines, and of nations. I hope I've been realistic. I hope that I haven't just, as we would say in English, mouthed platitudes, said things that everybody must think are theoretically true, but are sort of practically useful. I hope what I've done is recognize that there'll always be some friction. There'll always be some friction at these borders. And that's not a bad thing. It can sometimes be the thing, if you work at it, that gives birth to the pearl. But I've not spoken about one of the most important benefits of collaboration. For every one of those 19,000 papers that I mentioned earlier, there will be many more, thousands of more friendships and personal connections forged, whether that be in the lab, in the cafeteria, or even in Zoom calls and emails. The same will be true of those intercultural, interdisciplinary, or international collaborations that you undertake throughout your career. The connections that you forge will outlast any project, and in many instances can become lifelong friendships, paying no heed to borders and professions. In the context of China and the UK, I'm sure the network of personal connections and friendships will underpin the bright future of Sino-UK relations, both in business and research. But perhaps more importantly, it will ensure that the people-to-people dialogue that's the bedrock for strong relations between the UK and China is continued well into the future. In closing, given how much I know about the educational and research philosophy of this institution, I just encourage you to feel confident in your capacities to work across boundaries, but never to feel too comfortable or cozy. To finish back where I started, I'd encourage you to think what scale of measurement you might use to define your own career ambitions. Are you thinking in Wembley football pitches, New York Belgians, or Hainan Islands? If that's the case, you'll need to make sure that you are always working across divisions, using all those competencies, international, intercultural, interprofessional, that I've discussed today. And we at UCL will be very happy to work with you. And it is a shared spirit of that commitment to collaboration that have made Zhejiang and UCL such fruitful partners over, in particular, the time of our priority partnership, and that we look to making stronger as our partnership develops in the future. Thank you very much.